Welcome to Have a Life Teaching, the podcast designed for educators who are dedicated to enhancing their teaching practice and creating a positive impact on their students' lives. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the world of education, exploring a wide range of topics related to curriculum, instruction, and assessment in K-12 schools. Together, we'll learn from the brightest minds in the education field. So if you're a passionate educator who's ready to take your teaching practice to the next level, join us as we explore the exciting world of education. My name is John Shimbari, signing in and saying, let's have a life teaching. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Have a Life Teaching podcast. As some of you may know, before I became an instructional consultant and a school administrator, I was a history teacher. And one thing that I know excited me and excited my students was when we were looking at history in different ways, using different modalities, how can we engage our students more fully in their own learning? And one of those ways is definitely by using objects and having students really play with, manipulate those objects to really get them to study those objects. And so for this reason, I'm really excited today to be joined by my next guest. Her name is Leslie Hayes. She is the VP of Education at the New York Historical Society, premier historical organization in the Northeast. So highly recommend if you're in the area that you check it out. But she's going to really talk to us today about what educators can do if they don't have access to a museum or they can't always take a field trip, how they can be using objects more effectively in their classrooms, and just talking a little bit more about the benefit of doing that. So, Leslie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me. Thank you for that plug for the New York Historical Society. I'm so excited to be here, and I could talk about using objects all day. This is a great topic for me.
I love it. And it's easy to give a plug to the New York Historical Society. I've gone to many of your exhibits. And I want to get to, before we get to talking about what we're supposed to be talking about, I do want to get to the exhibit Then and Now to see how New York
Yes.
City has changed over time. I think that looks like a fascinating exhibit. The other one I really, really liked, not that there's been an exhibit I haven't liked at the Historical Society, but I really liked the one on slavery in New York as well. I thought
Oh,
that was very, very informative.
and I love that you bring that up because that exhibit and the educational materials and programs created around that exhibit is really what put our education department on the map. It's the reason that I do, in some ways, the work that I do, because that Slavery in New York show was such a high impact show for schools that we have the robust education department we have now. So you've picked a great one to highlight. And for listeners, we still have those curriculum materials on our website, should you be curious about that particular show.
I love that. And I do recommend that folks check those resources out. And that's a great segue, Leslie, into actually what my first question is going to be, which is how did museum education become an area of interest for you? And what is a day in the life of a VP of museum education look like? And what have been some of your highlights at the New York Historical Society in the job that you have now?
Yes, I got into this field because I grew up as a big history and museum nerd. And so I feel really lucky that whether I realized it or not, I suppose you could say museum education played a role in my upbringing, in my education, even though I didn't know that that was a field. And so I went the history route, the academia route, and came out the other side and thought, okay, I want to work in museums. And the only job title that I know in museums is curator. And like a lot of college and graduate students coming out with a history degree, thought, I'm going to be a curator now. And then when I started to learn what curators do, they do incredible work and make the exhibitions that you and I were just talking about. But I realized it wasn't actually hitting what I wanted and wasn't hitting what it was that I loved about museums, which is I loved the experience of being in the galleries and learning in the galleries. And so I had to do a little research and figure things out for myself, but suddenly discovered that there was this entire field called museum education of people that were interested in this very topic of how does one learn in a museum space, and very quickly fell in love with that field. And I think what kept me in the field was that I realized within that within the space of museum education, there was this particular niche of educators training teachers and working alongside classroom teachers, serving as professional development facilitators, helping bridge that gap, helping explain to teachers who then explain to their students what museums do, what curators do, what historians do. And I fell in love with that work and still love that work. I don't get to do it as much on the day to day. So as the VP for education now, I oversee the full range of the work that we do. So at New York Historical, we do everything from field trips and in museum visits to high school and college internships, to teacher professional development, as well as the creation of curriculum materials that are online. So I feel very fortunate that I get to do all of those things. And on any given day, I might be meeting with folks to help develop new programs, look at the status of new programs, raise money for those programs, evaluate those programs. However, one of, I think, the strengths of our department is that we really do try to ensure that everyone in our department, we have 20 plus folks working on all of those programs. We try to ensure that everybody is still a practitioner and still doing the work. And one of my favorite parts of my job is still every once in a while, I get to lead my own programs and I still get to go out in the galleries and do tours and look at objects and works of art. So that's still in there. I'm still an educator at heart.
On that note, Leslie, what are some of the more exciting projects you either have worked on or you're about to work on?
The one that always is near and dear to my heart, because I'm a teacher professional development nerd, is we run teacher institutes every summer. Teacher summer camp, if you will. They come to New York City. We meet Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 for 2 straight weeks. We bring in scholars, we bring in different members of our team, and we talk about a particular topic in history. A lot of the work I do is around women's history, so we often focus on different time periods. This summer, we're looking at the 1920s, 30s, and 40s with a lens of citizenship and womanhood. And we talk about that specific historical moment. We bring in scholars that are experts on it, but then we also talk about how do you do this in the classroom? What are what sources? How do you use those sources? How do you get students excited about this? How do you bring sometimes this very advanced content down to your students' level? How do you apply it to the scope and sequence of the curriculum that you are using? I personally love that work because it is, we get into the weeds, but we also get to sort of nerd out, if you will, on the content. It's this really beautiful blend of filling our own intellectual curiosity at the same time that we're being very practical about making sure teachers take something back to the classroom that will be useful and energize them. And I think right now more than ever, being able to energize teachers and make them feel supported and valued is so great. So that's one of my favorite things that I get to do. Other thing we're really proud of right now that we are in the process of ramping up is a program called the Tang Academy for American Democracy. This program is museum education on steroids, if you will. So we take all of the best parts of what we do and we have created a 4-day residency that happens here in the museum. So sixth grade classes of students come here to go to school for 4 days instead of going to their regular school, and they are just doing history and civics for those 4 days. You get to do voting exercises. We look at objects, which I know we're going to talk about. We look at works of art. We help students understand the evolution of democracy so that they are energized to participate in and protect the democracy that we have. It's important to me that we create things that are in service of schools, that are in service of students, in service of teachers, that fit what you all are already trying to accomplish, but we add our own spin on it, that it feels a little bit more immersive, that it feels a little bit more hands-on and interactive. I always say museum educators have the luxury of not having to necessarily worry about the standards or the tests. We want to make sure that we honor and recognize that there are those pressures on classroom teachers, but we also want to help make the space for something that might be a little bit more fun and a little less pressured because we're not feeling that on our own day to day in the museum.
Why bring in those objects? And I think you already started answering that, the engagement, the fun aspect of learning. And also, what makes a good object?
We at New York Historical say objects tell stories. In fact, that is the name of one of the galleries on our fourth floor. If you walk in, there's this beautiful screen rotating that says objects tell stories. And to me, that's the short why, is that there's so much that we can learn from a single object that makes objects incredibly powerful. I think in a way, we say we're so used to a picture says 1,000 words. I would say an object tells you even more than that. From a learning perspective, it's also tactile, especially when you're actually working with an actual object, and we can get into the what in a moment. But whenever possible, using an actual object allows for that tactile, literal hands-on experience that is hard to replicate and that can be so powerful for students, and is also so important for differentiating across students with different needs. To me, it also, that tactile piece also immediately shifts the way that students are engaging. They're not reading something, they're not even necessarily sitting still. They are physically passing something around, interacting with it, knocking on it, smelling it, feeling it. It makes history come alive immediately. Even if that item is a replica or something brand new, it's still very real and very concrete. And it immediately sparks this deeper understanding that history was a real place, and people that have clothes and things and objects that we interact with, so did people long ago. And I think that just making it real in that way, and that's not just for younger students, certainly for younger students, that's really powerful because they don't know what history is. But even for older students, even for adults, we need that constant reminder that the past was a real place and wasn't actually that different. So I think it really boils down to, from a pedagogy perspective, it can be very powerful and a great teaching tool. But from a history perspective, it also makes it come alive. And then the final thing I would say is that it replicates the actual practice of history, because we cannot forget that historians are practitioners. Historians aren't people memorizing a bunch of facts and spitting them back out in beautifully written books. They are people that are analyzing the stuff of the past to make meaning of it. And not all historians work with objects. A lot more of them feel more comfortable in archives and libraries and looking at things on paper. But so many historians, particularly curators, are all about looking at material culture and looking at objects. And I think it's really important that we help our students understand history as this interactive and almost scientific field. And what a great way to introduce that by saying, here's a piece of evidence, make meaning of that piece of evidence, as opposed to read this chapter in your textbook because it will tell you what is important about the experience. So I think that's the why. The what is an interesting one. My argument on the what is that it actually matters more. Choose an object that fulfills your learning goal. There aren't necessarily, I could give you a laundry list of really cool objects that we use with students that are my personal favorites. But in reality, the best possible object is the object that fits into what you're already doing. And if at all possible, is an object that you can actually use in your classroom. When we teach intro to object inquiry to teachers, we actually use a literal Dunkin Doughnuts coffee cup. And the reason we use it is because there is so much information you can learn about life in the 21st century from that cup, from the way it's made, from the way it's shaped, what it's made out of, printing on it, the slogan "America runs on Dunkin." We do an exercise where we sort of imagine you were a historian 1,000 years from now. What are you learning about this object? But uh, I have literally had half-hour to 45-minute conversations with teachers, with grown adults, about what you can learn from that coffee cup. Again, happy to sort of run through some of my favorite historic objects, but to me, it's more about finding something that excites you and finding something that you can bring into your classroom and pass around. It might be something in your house, it might be something you pick up at a yard sale. It doesn't have to be this very expensive historic replica. Better that it is something that captures their curiosity and their excitement and their interest. That's really what we're trying to emulate is that very real tangible experience.
Really like the immediacy of it. It really can connect students to the history in terms of this is the way we live now, but look at how we live now and how it is connected to the past. And what we were saying before, too, about telling a story, an object that tells the story, I think is important too. And I remember when I went to some of the concentration camps in Europe and actually saw the piles of
Hmm.
clothing and pots
Hmm.
and glasses, it gave me a whole new sense of the reality of it and the immensity of it more than reading numbers in a book.
Exactly. It's real. I mean, that sounds so obvious, but it's real. It's an item that was used by those people. As you said, you understand the scale of it. And it also, that example speaks to another really important thing about material culture, which is that it captures people that have been lost to history. People for whom we may not know their names, we may not know any more about them beyond that they existed and were in this place, and yet somehow they are still part of the story because of this item. And I think that is can be very powerful for a variety of reasons. It can be very powerful in an example like that, where we're talking about this sheer scale of humanity that has been lost. But it also brings to light the sort of nuances of people's day-to-day lives that might not have necessarily been considered important in the day-to-day. So perhaps they are not, when we think about going further back in history, thinking about the 19th or the 18th century, you look at eras where only the most privileged, only the most wealthy left anything of quote unquote record behind. Those objects illuminate all of those other people that didn't have the ability to leave behind official records. We know they exist because of the water buckets or the utensils or the clothing that they had. And I think that can be really important too, to remind students that George Washington did not live in a world where it was just him and the other
Mm.
so-called founding fathers. George Washington lived at a time where there were many other kinds of people of different genders and different races and different classes, and those people aren't necessarily left in the documents, but objects prove that they all existed. Again, we're humans like you and me, which means they also had brains and thoughts and hopes and dreams. And we have to sort of think about what those hopes and dreams would have looked like in addition to what George Washington and his peers hoped and dreamed for our country, for example.
Would you say then that one characteristic of an object to bring into a classroom is one that gets at the multidimensionality of a society, the
Mm.
haves and the have-nots? What would be some of the other things to consider in terms of bringing in an object?
I love that. I think another thing is to think about an object. Think about the design and the function of that object. And what does it tell us about what it would be like to live and exist in that moment? Sometimes we will use, when we do sort of the founding era or the colonial era, we look at items like a fire bucket. I love a fire bucket. Fire bucket from the 18th century is made out of leather. It's sewn, and so it's an interesting object because at first people say, well, it's a bucket. I'm like, okay, well, why would a bucket be made out of leather? Tell me about leather. Leather is expensive. This is not an item that you can just slap together. Why on earth, like, what would be the point of spending all of this money on a bucket that you're just going to carry water into the kitchen with, or you're going to feed your horse? A lot of people, the way it's designed, will say, oh, like I could feed my horse with it. Why would anyone spend that much money on a bucket to feed their horse? So you get into what the purpose of this bucket, and lo and behold, we find out it's a fire bucket. Well, why would people spend a lot of money on a fire bucket? Because fire was a huge threat. And also because of the design, it's not going to burn. If you're in a fire, it's not going to get hot. It's also lighter. So you put water in and it's heavy. You can see already we're talking about the design. So thinking about an object that answers a lot of those questions of what was it like to live at that time? What was unique about that time? What was different from that time than now? And what does that tell us about the lived experience of the people, but also the ingenuity, particularly when we're looking at items before and after the Industrial Revolution? Just thinking about how people spent their time and money and resources is really important. So I think that's a really critical piece. And then, of course, thinking about what are items that speak directly to something specific that you are teaching. Another sort of entry point is to think about, okay, I'm studying X time period. What items might speak to that? So, for example, we have when we do our World War II lessons, we found literally on eBay, and we can talk more about where we find these things. It's not; these are things that you can also find. We have a helmet that an air raid warden would have worn, a metal helmet with sort of a weird logo on it. It's unexpectedly heavy, but we can talk about why would this hat exist and what does this tell us about what people were afraid of? Why would you need to walk around your neighborhood in this helmet during the war when you're at the home front? So something like that that is very real and very tangible and gets right to the heart of what you're teaching. So because we know time is of the essence. So how do we get right to that moment? And because we're in New York City, we're close to Ellis Island, we do some immigration programming. We have items that might seem like everyday items, but they're items that were used in the medical inspections as people were coming to Ellis Island. Even something as simple as a lice comb. We can look at a comb and talk about why is it important. Well, it's important because you had to go through a medical examination. And when you talk about something visceral, the idea of getting off a boat, not speaking the language, and having a stranger walk up to you and check under your eyelids and run a comb through your hair, it starts to feel very real. I think that's another way to come up with what is the object you want to teach with is think about sit and stop and think, even looking at photographs from that era, look at what items are in those pictures. You would be surprised. A lot of those items are everyday items that you might even have something similar in your own home that you could bring in and have the students study from that perspective. Something that represents the day to day of the era in which you're studying.
We're obviously talking about objects in a historical sense.
Yeah.
What makes a good object for perhaps English language arts? And what might make a good object if I'm thinking of the four core content areas in science, let's say?
Yeah.
And again, I know that's not 100% a fair question to
Well,
ask you.
let's see where I can go. I'll say this. I once was asked to go do our intro to objects to an entire school. The gym teacher of all people, his hand shot up in the air at the end and he went, I never thought of this before, but I'm going to do object inquiry. And he had his basketball with him. He's like, with this basketball, like, why are there bumps on it? Why are there these black lines on it? Why is it this size versus the size of a tennis ball? It got me so excited that yes, in fact, this can be done. So for the gym teachers out there listening, do it with all of the different athletic equipment. It will totally work. I will also cheat and say something that's coming to mind immediately with younger grades, if you're thinking ELA, is thinking about even just the things you are teaching with and the things that kids are interacting with. We do a lot of the same things we're talking about with object inquiry you can do with books. So it's a little bit different, but I think interacting with the books and talking about just deep understanding how a book works and why people make books the way they do is a really interesting intro to students to help them understand how to navigate from an ELA perspective. So I want to throw that out there. Take all of these principles and apply them to help with your literacy. In the science classroom, this is a little bit of a cop out, so you may definitely need to look at another expert. But what I will say is all of the things we've been talking about in terms of design and why things are made the way they are absolutely do apply to STEM and science in two ways. One, it also can be used to help understand the equipment or the tools that you are using in the classroom. Absolutely. So I think there's a way to engage, bring in objects in that way, where if you're bringing in microscopes, for example, talking through that piece of equipment and sort of, the historian in me can't help but explore sort of how those have evolved over time. And thinking about that is a really interesting way to bring in that object inquiry from a science perspective. Also, the way that we analyze objects as historians is very similar to the way the scientific method works. That I would argue anything that you are studying from the natural world, anything that you are looking at or examining closely in science, you could be asking the exact same questions that we're talking about in this history conversation. Particularly thinking about if you are doing drawings or examinations. Earlier today, I was talking to a colleague around dissecting animals, all of those things. Not to say that an animal is an object, but there is absolutely a way to apply that same learning and that same approach to what you're doing in that classroom. With ELA, often in ELA, teachers are and students are reading books set in the past. We do not envy at all in our world English teachers, because you have to, within a matter of minutes, explain to students the history of some event so that they can understand the book. So I completely understand that challenge teachers face. Again, objects could be a great entry point of you don't have time to teach them the entire history of this thing, but this object could be the spark that helps them understand the historical context of the book you're about to read.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about, we talked about what makes a good object and why we want to use objects in our classroom. So let's say a teacher isn't able to go on a field trip for any number of reasons, either
Absolutely.
access to a museum or money or time, and they themselves want to bring an object in.
Yeah.
How can they introduce that object? How can they build that into their lesson plan?
Yeah. So, first things first, I'll talk about real quickly, where does all this stuff come from? And I alluded to this earlier. For the most part, the objects, even that we use in the museum, we have a huge, what we call touch object collection that our department, our education department, takes care of. Most of that stuff comes from eBay, yard sales, antique sales, online vendors, places where people are selling old things. We are not spending a lot of money on them. So I always want to highlight that. We do sometimes buy replica items. Every once in a while, we might drop some money on one of those. But for the most part, we're talking about stuff that people just don't want anymore, that we are happy to take off their hands. Etsy is another great one. When we get into the 20th century, honestly, sometimes we bring stuff in from home. So I always like to start there and say, again, don't overthink it. Think about what you have access to. For $15, you can buy gardening tools to talk about westward expansion, things like that. So look online. You will be surprised at how little money some of these things cost, and you'll be competing with museums around the country also trying to buy them. So that's a first thing. First things first is you obviously have to get the object and think creatively, and you can do it on the cheap, I promise you. What it looks like, I think, is what excites me. And the good news is that once you get this process down that I'm about to walk through, you can use it as much as you want with all kinds of items. And you can also apply it to non-three-dimensional objects, whether it's photos, works of art, etc. Here's the big secret about New York Historical. We are basically just pushing the same three-step process. What we always do when we're working with an object is we start with our observations. You want to have students just examine and study that item. And that's where the scientific method can really come in handy, because your students might be familiar with that. Pass it around, let them hold it, let them feel it, let them knock on it, let them pull on it if appropriate and it's not going to break. Tell them to use all of their senses, except maybe taste. Really engage with the item. I'm a big supporter of allowing the teacher to just stand at the front of the room and write down what they're hearing in terms of observations. Allow the teacher to be the note taker. You can even have a system of we're going to pass it around twice. So that's that way the second time it gets harder, but surely everybody can say something. Size, shape, color, material. Keep it to observations. Don't guess what it is. Don't make assumptions. Don't make hypotheses. Just think about, again, what is in front of you. If someone says small, the next person can say, well, how small? And there's your STEM. How many inches, how many centimeters, how many pounds? Start to make it interdisciplinary. From there, then you start to move into the territory of, well, what is this thing? And every time you start talking about that, you go back to the evidence. Well, how do you know that? What makes you think that? And that's what can be fun about using an object like a coffee cup is it's easy to say, well, it's a coffee cup from Dunkin' Donuts. Tell me how you know. Well, it's written on it. And how do you know it's for coffee? Well, interesting. It's made out of paper. It says, it might say caution hot. So I'm thinking it's a hot beverage. Here are hot beverages that we drink. Is it coffee? Is it tea? How do we know? So you always want to push this is your chance to push the envelope a little bit. How do we know? As you start to formulate together as a class or as a group what this thing is, then you can start moving into the third layer of conversation is well, okay, so what does that tell us about history or whatever subject it is that you're teaching? What are the takeaways? So at some point in that process, you as the teacher come in and say, yes, everyone, you're absolutely right. This is a coffee cup from Dunkin' Donuts from 2024. What do all of these observations, what does this conversation tell us about this society, about this era? And so with the coffee cup, it's that people want their caffeine. All of these options written on it tell us that they like it to have it their way, and there's a lot of customization. They care about recycling because there's a recycling symbol on it, but also they don't care that much because they're willing to get a new paper cup every day and throw it away. So we start to think about these inferences. That's where you, as the educator, really get to open the floodgates because you can ask the questions you're really trying to get at, which is what does it mean? But it all starts with that very simple question of what do you see, what do you notice? My big advice is you asked, well, how do teachers do this? What do they need? The thing you do need to carve out is some time. I know time is of the essence and there's so many things to do, but I promise you, setting aside that time to do the observation allows for a much richer conversation. If you rush that piece, it almost isn't worth doing because you've lost the real idea here, which is to really engage with the thing. So that's the process, and I will also add that you can replicate that process in so many different ways. It's great if you have the luxury to model it at least once in the school year, so everybody gets to do it all together as a class. That can be really fun and really engaging. But this is the kind of thing that we do in pairs, we do in small groups. You can have students at their centers, at their tables, each working with a different object. You're floating around. Maybe there's a chart paper, a note taker, or some way to capture what they're doing. But you would be surprised if you model that protocol once for students, they can absolutely replicate it.
Indeed. And in fact, one thing I often tell teachers to do, Leslie, is to go look online at the National School Reform Faculty Protocols.
Oh, they're
These
great.
are just, aren't they? They could be used for so many things. They could even be used with the object. So
Yes.
when you were talking about having group roles and having a way of discussing an object, I thought immediately about the Save the Last Word for Me protocol, where each
Yes.
student in turn could talk about what that object symbolizes for them or what they think about that object, with everyone around that table then commenting on that person's comment before they go. So I agree with you. I think if you do it once, if you take the time to collect these objects, if you take the time to build them into your lesson plans, into your annual plans, the benefit will be multifold because
Oh,
once you
oh
model
yeah.
it, the students, like you said, I think will get more interested in history.
The other thing I will say is we know for a fact this is true, at least in our programs. We have a residency program here in New York where we go and visit classrooms 9 times throughout the year. And I will tell you, after session one, the students know it, whether they are kindergarteners or 11th graders. They know when we come, okay, it's time to look at objects. So we've seen the evidence too that it really does work, and the students light up. We had an educator at a school just today in a high school classroom, and the students are sort of, why are you here? What are you doing? What is this museum? And the minute she pulled an object out of the bag and said, okay, pass this around, it was a whole different group of students. So it really can shift the energy. As you say, it engages so many different kinds of students in a way that almost nothing else can, because the one thing we all have in common is we exist in a world full of stuff. So letting them engage with the stuff is sort of a great equalizer.
Now, Leslie, is there anything we haven't talked about that you think listeners who are interested in using objects need to know?
I would really emphasize the don't be afraid, don't feel like you need to be an expert. You just really that piece. And the other thing I will emphasize that tends to be a very common pitfall connected to this idea of time is the best object inquiry is where you as the teacher kind of remove yourself as the expert and let this be a student-led learning activity. Your moment to shine will come, but you've got to let them do the learning, do the hypothesizing, do all of the wondering, the seeing and the thinking and the wondering's got to come first from them, and then you'll have your moment to shine. So that's always my final tip to teachers is don't jump the gun. Don't tell them too soon what it is. Let them have that cool experience first, and that will pay off and the learning will be richer because of it.
Where can people find out more about you and the wonderful work you do?
The best place to find me is to come find us at New York Historical Society. You can find all of our programs and resources at nyhistory.org/education. You can learn more about our programs, but more importantly, you can learn about all of the free resources that we have in our curriculum library. I should also give a plug that during the school year, every Wednesday evening online for free, we do a 1-hour virtual teacher workshop. So if you want to see any of what we've been talking about in action online, please come join us. And again, you can just go to nyhistory.org/education. We would absolutely love to hear from you. I'll also throw my email address out there. I am leslie.hayes@nyhistory.org.
Thanks again, Leslie. This has been a really informative conversation, and I appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening today. I hope you got some great tips that you can bring back into your teaching. Remember, have a life teaching without sacrificing your own. Also, don't forget to subscribe and be well.